Okay, so this is the last lecture in the receptor theory lectures. So today I'm going to tell you how the models that I described in the last couple of lectures don't actually, a bit of an echo here, don't actually fully explain how drugs work. So if we go back to the first lecture that we did, is there less echo now? It's still just as bad. Can you all hear me without the microphone? There must be another microphone here. Is there still an echo? It's better. I think it's this microphone here. So that might be better. So to address what we're talking about today, we need to talk about a few concepts and go back to the lecture a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed efficacy. So that's the ability of a drug to activate a receptor and cause a response. And if you remember, that's what we called the property of agonist drugs. And I've spent quite a lot of detail talking about how agonists must first bind to cause a response or to cause an effect. So that gives us the sort of Clark's occupational model or receptor theory. Of course, once binding has occurred, and binding is described by this equilibrium here, and we measure that as affinity. It's the ability to cause an effect that we measure as efficacy. So in other words, it's probably quite logical to think the response that we get from receptors is dependent on the number of receptors that are occupied. And while I'm going to tell you this isn't quite true, it's not directly proportional, it does hold true. The more receptors that you occupy, the more response that you... So just to cast your minds back about concentration response curves, because I'll be talking about them a lot again in this lecture. The main things that we get from a concentration response curve is we get the maximum effect produced by a drug. We also measure the EC50, so that's the value that we get 50% of that maximum response. And that EC50 value is what we generally as pharmacologists use to describe as potency. And again, I'll refer you back to the other slides and video that I've posted. It's important to realize that this EC50, as we discovered, is not an estimate of agonist affinity. And it's also important to remember that receptor occupancy and the response that you get is a non-linear relationship. In other words, if you remember back to the first lecture, there's a kind of amplification step in between a drug binding to a receptor and then getting a response. But what we've not discussed so far is more complex drug actions. We've discussed some drugs that are agonists and some drugs that are antagonists. But there are other types of drugs. So there's another class of drugs which do occur frequently, and they will bind to a receptor, they'll occupy that receptor, and they will activate the receptor. But no matter how much of that drug you add, you'll never be able to get the maximal response. And these are what we call partial agonists. And the idea of partial agonism, as if I have time later, is really important in today's drug discovery programs, because we're also coming around to the idea that some drugs have biased agonism. That means they'll activate certain receptor pathways from a receptor compared to other drugs. And often they would have been included under this branch of partial agonism. So if we go back to fractional occupancy, that's the fraction of receptors that are occupied, where A is the concentration of the drug or the agonist. And from that, we'll get the association. Fractional occupancy depends upon the association constant. It's just the reciprocal of the dissociation constant. And therefore, hopefully you can see it's dependent upon the affinity, the Ka, and the concentration of the drug that you get will determine how many of the receptors are occupied. It's simply like the law of mass action, that the more receptors occupied, the more concentration of drug you have, the greater the response. But it starts to get a bit sticky because that response, the number of receptors occupied to the overall response, is that occupancy is not proportional to the response that you get out, or not directly proportional. And it's really important to remember that maximal responses to many agonists are actually obtained with much less than 100% of the receptors have been occupied. You don't have to occupy all the receptors on the tissue to get the maximum response. You only have to occupy a certain fraction of them. So if we go back to partial agonists, essentially partial agonists produce a lower response or a lower Emax than that produced by a full agonist. So if we look at the full agonist in blue, you can see there that is the Emax. And it causes a 100% fractional response. In other words, the maximum response that tissue can produce. Now, if we look in the presence of a partial agonist, shown in pink, remember this drug is an agonist. We've got no antagonist drugs present here. And as we increase the concentration of that partial agonist, it doesn't matter if we keep on increasing the concentration, we never, ever, ever produce that maximum response that's possible. And that means the drug is still an agonist because it's evoking an effect, but it can't evoke the Emax produced by a full agonist. So in other words, that gives us another property, and we're going back to that property of efficacy. So efficacy of a drug is determined by the maximum response that it can produce. So a partial agonist produces less than one efficacy. A full agonist produces the full response, so its efficacy is equal to 1. And that's why you need to get the ideas of potency and efficacy completely split in your minds, because potency is the amount of a drug that causes half the maximal response. And in this example, these two drugs have similar EC50 values, if not identical EC50 values. The only difference between them is the Emax. The partial agonist is not less potent because it has the similar EC50 value. It's just less efficacious. Hopefully, it's just to show you there, the EC50 value for the partial agonist and the full agonist are exactly the same. So they're equipotent, but they have different efficacies. So just to hammer that point home is that the relative potency of a drug is completely independent of its efficacy. So here we're looking at drugs that activate histamine receptors, and this is all on the problem with potency PowerPoint as well. And what we can see is that drugs 1 and 2 are both full agonists. They produce a maximal response. And it's quite clear that drugs 3 and 4 both are partial agonists. They're producing a response but not producing the E max. So if we're going to rank these drugs in order of efficacy, then clearly drugs 1 and 2 are equal, but drug 4 has greater efficacy than drug 3. So the rank order of efficacy would be this here. But if we then re-rank those drugs in terms of their potency, we get a very different picture. By far and away, the most potent drug is drug 4, because drug 4's EC50 is the lowest EC50 value. Yeah, so it's the most potent because the amount of that drug to be able to produce the half maximal response produced by that drug and that drug only is much, much lower. So it's much more potent. Drugs 1 and 3 have about the same potency, and drug 2 has less potency because it has the higher 50 value. Sorry if I skipped a bit fast there. So what explains this action of partial agonists? So far, we've been all about models of receptor theory involving occupancy. But reduced receptor occupancy does not explain the action of partial agonists. They don't occupy less receptors. I think the example I've got here, and this example, if you want it in larger text, is found in the Rang and Dale pharmacology textbook, is if we look at alpha-1 adrenoreceptors, they are the type of receptors that you have on your blood vessels that cause constriction. So if you've done the aorta practical already, or you're doing it next term, you're going to be using drugs that activate alpha-1 adrenoreceptors. So if we look, first of all, in terms of response, we have, in all the drugs listed here, this one here, phenylephrine, is a full agonist. Okay, this top load of concentration response curves shows us the concentration response curve. So phenylephrine there is the only full agonist. But what you might notice is if we look at the response and this time plot it against the fraction, plot it against the fraction of receptors that are actually occupied, you'll see that you get, with phenylephrine, it's probably a bit more than 60%, but you can see you get quite a large response. Sorry, here, that's about 50% there. So you're getting almost the maximum response to phenylephrine with only occupying 50% of the receptors. And what you can see here is there's a series of different drugs acting at these receptors. The names are kind of inconsequential, but these drugs are all partial agonists. And you can see that every single one of these drugs can occupy all the receptor sites, but none of them can evoke that maximal response. This is all the receptor sites being bound. So the number of receptor sites that are occupied do not explain the actions of these partial agonists. In other words, partial agonists can occupy receptors to the same extent as full agonists. The reason they're not causing a full effect is because they basically have lower intrinsic efficacy. They're unable to produce the response in the same way as the full agonist. And there could be lots of different reasons why that is. That means we have to go back to those simple models, the Clark's model of occupation, and tweak that to take into account that the occupancy of the receptor is not directly proportional to its response. And that's what we call the Stevenson modification. And you can probably see here, we're going back a long way in time to 1956, where this was first noted. I think that's the first time it was clear that this isn't just a simple law of mass action where more in, more out. There has to be an amplification step. That's what, basically our second messengers are doing, amplifying that receptor signal, the second messenger pathways that are coupled to those receptors. So occupancy of the receptor is important, but we also have this intrinsic efficacy, the ability to stimulate those amplification steps. The key thing there is that the response is not directly proportional to the stimulus. And that helps to explain why we can get a maximal response without having to occupy all the receptors. So sorry, just to run through that again. So the response is governed by occupancy and efficacy. Intrinsic activity factor here dictates the action of agonists, with 1 being a full agonist, less than 1 a partial agonist, and 0 being an antagonist that can't produce a response. But partial agonists are actually really clinically relevant types of drugs. You might think, well, I don't want a partial agonist, I want a full agonist in my drug design process, but that's not always the case, because sometimes we might want to alter a body system or a response in some way, but we don't want to produce the maximum response. And a good example of this, and I'll give an example of it, is opioid painkillers. You've probably heard that, of propofol is sort of an epidemic in America. And that is actually a full agonist at opioid receptors. Actually turns out that morphine and heroin, or heroin is converted into morphine in the body, is actually a partial agonist. So increasing and acting as a full agonist can be effective, but it can also be very, very dangerous in terms of drug use. So sometimes we want that submaximal response because it might give us a better safety profile. In other words, we're not fully stimulating the system. The other advantage of these drugs, and probably Dr. Cottrell will talk about receptor desensitization. When you stimulate receptors and leave the drug stimulating a receptor, often over time that response begins to disappear because the receptors become desensitized. They stop working, they stop signaling, and then eventually they get degraded and destroyed. And partial agonists can actually cause less of that desensitization, so you can get a more prolonged response to the drug. The other advantage is that partial agonists still occupy those receptors. They can often occupy those receptors as well or better than full agonists. It just depends. But unlike using an antagonist drug, we're not fully blocking the system. So you can imagine if you use an antagonist drug, sometimes you completely block a response in the body. And again, sometimes that's not ideal because you might not want that to happen. You might want some background signaling to occur. In some cases, that could actually be really dangerous or fatal. An example of that is, you take a neuromuscular blocker they're really good at blocking the action of all your muscles, but also you stop breathing. You know, you get the idea. So sometimes a partial agonist could be. Okay, so sorry. Buprenorphine is used as an opioid dependence and pain relief, although methadone is probably the drug of choice for that. And the reason it's so effective is that you can use it as a pain reliever, but it's less strong than morphine or propranolol as well. So in other words, it has less of the side effects that come along with intense pain relief with opioids, but enough to kill the pain. Obviously, if someone's addicted to opioid type drugs, then they get really bad withdrawal symptoms. So if you give them a partial stimulus to help keep those withdrawal symptoms at bay, they can slowly come off that drug without experiencing the withdrawal symptoms and therefore a rebound back into taking the drug. And again, because of receptor desensitization for morphine addicts, that can be very dangerous because they might go back to taking their old dose and kill themselves. That's probably how most morphine overdoses come about. So it's worth bearing in mind for partial agonists, they are clinically useful drugs. They're drugs that only produce a submaximal response, but they're still agonists. So they're agonists that can't evoke a maximal effect, even if all the receptors are occupied. But they also reveal that responses are not just dependent on the number of receptors occupied, but some kind of other intrinsic ability to evoke responses. And this paves the way to biased agonism, which isn't covered a lot in this course because it's a bit more advanced, but a lot of drugs being designed now are being designed as biased agonists to only have certain effects of activating a receptor. And some clinically useful drugs have been specifically designed as partial agonists as well. So what that discussion of partial agonists brings up another concept, and that's the concept that there is a reserve of receptors. We've discussed the fact that some drugs can bind to all the receptors and not cause a maximal response, but some agonists can actually produce a maximal response without binding to all of the receptors available in that tissue. And that gives us, we call this redundancy, or more receptors than we're required to actually evoke response, receptor reserve. And you can, you can see receptor reserve in action when you look at irreversible antagonists, which I spoke about last week or on Friday. So here, what we're showing is a concentration response curve to an agonist in increasing concentrations, so here, here, and here, of a irreversible antagonist. Okay. So normally, this is a full agonist, we get a maximum response produced. Now, this particular irreversible antagonist, when it's bound to 50% of the receptors that are available, which is shown by the curve that I've just put a star on, we still get that maximum response. We still get that maximum response. So that means that agonist that we're using can evoke a maximal response with only 50% of the total receptors in the tissue available. If you start to increase the concentration of the irreversible antagonist, and now only 45% of the receptors are available, then you start to see a decrease in that maximum response. And here, when 40% are available, you see a further decrease. So what it means is that there's a huge reserve of receptors. In this example, you need only need about 50% of the receptors to produce a maximal response. So there's a massive receptor reserve. In other words, tissues have lots of spare receptors, which on the face of it can seem a bit odd and a bit wasteful, but there are reasons underlying that. So what does receptor reserve mean? Well, it means that in a tissue, in a cell, there's a proportion of the receptors are never used. They never need to be occupied in order to get that response. But what it also means is that if we've got spare receptors, reserve receptors, some kind of amplification step must occur in that tissue in order to get the maximal response. So it's not just a property of the receptor as to what level of response you get. It depends on the tissue that's been stimulated as well. And this partially explains tissue selectivity of drugs. If a tissue expresses a very high concentrations of a particular type of receptor, then you're more likely to get a big response by stimulating that receptor in that tissue. If there's very low levels of receptor density on a tissue, it's likely that the responses are going to be much smaller in comparison. So that's why we talk about drugs. For example, you probably hear with beta blockers are cardioselective. And they're only cardioselective because the receptors they act on are highly expressed in the heart and less highly expressed in other tissues in the body. So it's the expression or the amount of expression of proteins in a cell that can alter signal amplification. So that was discovered by a pharmacologist called Furchgott, who then later went on to discover nitric oxide as a vasodilator. So those who've done the aorta experiment, that experiment won a Nobel Prize. So there you go. It also has a really good advantage for pharmacologists and people who want to manipulate these responses, because it means it's possible to cause really large responses at a tissue at very low concentrations of drug. That's good if we're designing a drug, because a drug is a xenobiotic. Your body wants to get rid of it. Yeah, it's not a natural substance. Well, in most cases, it's not a natural substance. So the less of it you have in there, the less likely it is it's going to have non-specific toxic effects. So we really want a potent drug that is very efficacious that we can use at low concentrations. And receptor reserve helps us. It's like biology has given us a hand in that that is possible. So what is that Furchgott modification? So the response is dependent on the receptor number, occupancy, and intrinsic efficacy. And that F factor depends on two things. It depends on what we call tissue factors, in other words, properties of the cells that have been stimulated. That means the transduction pathways and the number of receptors expressed on that tissue. You can have lots of receptors expressed on the tissue, but if you don't have the correct second messenger systems expressed in that cell as well, then you're not going to get much of a response. But it also depends upon the drugs as well. So that the drug properties are how well it occupies the receptors, in other words, the affinity, and their intrinsic efficacy, which I spoke about earlier. So there's lots of things that actually depend on the effect of a drug. And it's not just the effect, it's not just the properties of the drug. It's worth bearing in mind that the tissues themselves have a large bearing upon what. And that's pretty much where pharmacology got to until about the 1980s. And really there was drugs were classified as agonists, antagonists, partial agonists. But round about the molecular biological revolution that happened in the 1980s, started to realize a really strange property called inverse agonism. It's that some drugs seem to be able to bind to a receptor but cause the opposite effect to an agonist. It's worth bearing in mind that this concept really vehemently and highly rejected for many years by many pharmacologists, but it actually is becoming to appear that it is true. So an inverse agonist actually seems in most cases or in most tissues to behave like an antagonist. And that's why lots of people oppose the idea of inverse agonism. But in certain conditions, you can actually get the opposite effect. And since it's kind of been accepted that this occurs, you have to radically review receptor theory. It's not a matter of agonist, receptor, they bind, response. Something different is going on. So this is what we call the two-state model, which was developed by James Black and by Leff. And what they said to explain this concept of receptors being able to produce an opposite effect is that receptors, proteins, like most proteins, exist not in one state sitting at rest all the time. They're constantly in equilibrium, switching between an inactive state and an active state. So they're constantly cycling without the action of any drugs between inactive and active. It just happens that at rest, before they're stimulated by a hormone, probably the equilibrium is very much in this direction, and the majority of the receptors are sitting in an inactivated state. And what that means is when a drug binds, it might be able to push that drug into the activated state or lock the drug in the activated state. So you can imagine agonists would shift that equilibrium over to the activated state. So what does that mean in terms of inverse agonists? Well, we've got the two-state model, which I'll come back to in a moment, but it means we've got a kind of spectrum of drug activity. We know that antagonists or normal antagonists block the actions of agonists. So in other words, we say that they have a neutral effect on the receptor. We say that full agonists have a positive effect on the receptor, force the receptors in some way into the activated state, and that the inverse agonists have a negative action on the receptor. In other words, force the receptors into the inactivated state. Bearing in mind at rest, normally the receptors cycling between the two states. So just to put that back into the two-state model, and what does it mean? So we've got the receptors in their two states, inactivated and activated. We call the inactivated state the resting state. Okay, but bearing in mind there's an equilibrium. And at rest, the equilibrium is very much in this direction towards the resting state of the receptor. But there will always be constitutive activity in the absence of any drugs. Now, what the two-state model suggests is that agonists prefer to bind to this activated state, and therefore, if you like, lock the responses into that activated state, and therefore we get a response. And it looks like an activation because what the agonist is doing is locking that receptor into the activated state. And it means as the receptors are constantly cycling between the two states, when a receptor goes into that activated state and an agonist binds, then it becomes activated. This theory suggests that inverse agonists, they bind to the resting state. So they help lock the receptors into this inactive state. But because the receptors are normally cycling, it appears that they have a negative effect. Antagonists, on the other hand, according to this model, they bind to both states. And they prevent the binding of inverse agonists or agonists and have a neutral effect on the receptors. So they don't stop the receptor recycling between states. They're equally affinity for both states and therefore don't appear to invoke a response. So that's pretty confusing for some of you, I'm sure. It's probably well worth remembering this two-state model. And it's the simplest model that explains most drug actions. That's why we're teaching about here. I won't lie, reality is far more complicated than this. And we have multi-dimensional models, biased agonism, and so on, with multiple active states, multiple inactive states. It's just too complex. The kind of mathematics you need for this and the modeling is the kind of thing that only really mathematicians can do in conjunction with pharmacologists. But I suppose the key thing here is, are inverse agonists clinically useful? And as I say, many of the drugs that are out there on the market and we call antagonists actually behave a little bit like inverse agonists as well. Certainly under certain conditions. We just don't normally see it because normally receptors are, the equilibrium is very much towards the inactivated state. We don't see it functionally when we look. But and that's the reason why many pharmacologists used to believe that inverse agonists were an artifact of experimental design, because in that molecular biology revolution, we started to use overexpression receptor systems. We would take the gene for receptor and cram it into a cell and make that cell express bucket loads of the receptor, far more than any tissue would in the body. And that's great because we can do lots of studies and look at binding affinity, responses without the noise of all the other receptors that the tissue would normally express. But that massive overexpression of receptors means that there's more likely to be a basal activity in those cells. So when you put on what you think is an inverse agonist, an antagonist would perhaps have a similar effect. But it does happen in vivo, but only really at tissues where we've got lots and lots of receptors. So it's not something we see actively in vivo. But inverse agonists have been designed, and I suppose the classic one is rimonabant, which was specifically for cannabinoid receptors, and that was developed and hit the market in 2006. And the basic idea here is, we know this is an inverse agonist. Okay, people who smoke dope, they get stoned. Yeah, that's why they do, but they also get hungry, right? So if the agonist makes you hungry, inverse agonist will stop the hunger, right? So we can just give an inverse agonist to obese people and they won't be hungry anymore. Yeah, it'll kill the hunger. And actually, it worked. It did help to treat obesity. It did help people lose weight, help people give up smoking and other things as well. Unfortunately, it made lots of people depressed, and they started killing themselves when taking it. So it was about 2 years after hitting the market. So we often talk about phases of drug discovery and trials. We talk about phase 1, first in human, phase 2, first in disease, phase 3, a large trial, gets regulatory approval. Phase 4 is where it's monitored, an approved drug is monitored in the market. And they found in that process that actually these people will be getting depressed and killing themselves. So it had to be rapidly withdrawn. So perhaps there will be a need for or a use for a specific inverse agonist, but it's worth bearing in mind that lots of the drugs we call antagonists actually are in reality inverse agonists. It's just that we didn't know that when we were designing those drugs. So that means at the state of play now, we basically have 4 main drug classifications when we're looking at drugs based on what type of response that they cause. So we're familiar with the agonist. When you increase the concentration of an agonist, you get a response, and a full agonist produces the maximal response that that tissue can produce. We have partial agonists that don't cause a full response, but can occupy all the receptors, and they can be clinically useful drugs. In most tissues, if we added increasing concentrations of antagonist onto the tissue, we'd get a flat line. We'd get no response, because by the occupational model or the two-state model, antagonists just block the actions of occupy the receptor sites for agonists. So while they will block the actions of an agonist on their own, they don't normally cause a response. And we have the inverse agonists that produce the complete opposite response, or if you like, a negative response compared to an agonist. So again, there is some further study on this. You can read about this in chapter 2 of Rang and Dale. If you're really interested to go in a bit more detail about receptor theory, there's also an article that I've posted. And it's worth bearing in mind to know the difference between occupancy theory and the operational model and the two-state model, because they're things we will be examining.